The rumor didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It moved the way dangerous ideas always do, quietly passed from one voice to another. A few words at first, embarrassed to be spoken. Someone had heard something. Someone knew someone. It sounded too hateful to be practical, too bold to be real. A church. A bomb. The kind of threat people wanted to dismiss because believing it meant admitting how fragile safety really was. Harlem had learned to separate noise from intent. Empty racism was loud, predictable, designed to provoke fear and then retreat. This felt different. Details began to line up in a way that made denial uncomfortable. Names repeated themselves across conversations that had no connection to each other. A date surfaced, not vague but specific. A time of day. A building everyone recognized. The rumor stopped sounding like hate and started sounding like logistics. No one panicked. Panic was wasteful. Instead, the neighborhood did what it always did when something felt wrong. It listened. Shopkeepers lingered in doorways longer than usual. Church elders spoke in lowered voices after evening services. Men who had lived long enough to recognize patterns felt a tightening in their chests they didn't need to explain. This wasn't a threat meant to scare. It was one meant to erase. The idea of a bombing struck at something deeper than territory or money. Churches were not just buildings in Harlem. They were anchors, places where grief was carried, where hope was practiced out loud, where generations learned how to stand upright in a world that preferred them bowed. To attack one was to announce that nothing sacred would be spared. Word reached Bumpy Johnson without drama. No messenger burst through a door. No emergency meeting was called. It arrived the same way everything important did, through someone who understood the weight of what they were saying. Bumpy listened once. He did not ask for clarification. He did not question motives. He understood immediately what allowing such a thing would mean. This was not about intimidation. This was about precedent. If a church could be targeted, then every boundary Harlem believed in became negotiable. Law enforcement, slow and selective, would arrive after the damage, if it arrived at all. Courts would argue about jurisdiction and proof. None of that would rebuild trust or restore the sense of safety that held the neighborhood together. Bumpy knew the difference between threats that sought attention and plans that sought results. The names being whispered were not random. They belonged to men who believed terror was a tool, not a message. Harlem had faced hatred before, but this was organized, deliberate, and timed. Fear moved through the streets without showing its face. Mothers walked children home a little faster. Doors were checked twice at night. There were no speeches, no calls for marches. Everyone understood that noise would only invite the wrong kind of attention. What was needed now was certainty. Bumpy felt the weight of it settle into him, familiar and unwelcome. He had dealt with violence and betrayal, but this carried a different gravity. This was not a challenge to his authority. It was a challenge to the right of his people to exist without terror. Ignoring it was not an option. Some threats demand police, others demand restraint. This one demanded responsibility. Power, when it exists, creates obligation. The rumor was real enough to act on, and acting meant moving quietly, precisely, and without leaving room for escalation. Harlem did not yet know what would happen next. It only knew that something had crossed a line too old to be debated. The threat hung in the air, unresolved, waiting to see whether it would be answered with fear or with final. The church sat on its block like a promise kept. Brick worn smooth by decades of hands, doors opened and closed by generations who learned to trust what waited inside. On Sundays it held hymns and patience. On weekdays it held meetings, meals, tutoring, and quiet counsel for people who needed a place to breathe. In Harlem, Churches were not simply houses of worship. They were infrastructure, stitched into daily life where other systems failed. When factories closed and schools neglected children, the church organized. When landlords pressed and bills piled, the church mediated. It collected coats in winter, taught reading at night, and registered voters when politics pretended not to see them. It was where grief gathered without explanation and joy survived without permission. To target it was to announce contempt for everything it protected. The planners understood this. They were not choosing in convenience or visibility. They chose meaning. A church carried memory, and memory outlasts fear. Destroying a building would not just injure bodies, it would attempt to erase continuity. It would say the past was disposable and the future negotiable. That is why the threat cut so deeply. It was ideological warfare dressed as terror. Harlem recognized the logic immediately. The building stood as proof that dignity could be organized. It showed how people built order without approval, care without credit, and authority without titles. Attacking it was an attempt to shatter that example. The message would not be subtle. It would declare that safety was conditional and belonging temporary. Churches had long been targets because they gathered people who refused to disappear. They taught discipline and hope in equal measure, and that combination frightened those who relied on chaos. Sermons became classrooms, choirs became networks, pews became planning tables. Power did not need to be loud when it was shared. The rumor made sense in this context, and that was the most chilling part. Hate alone rarely plans carefully. It explodes and retreats. This threat was measured. It aimed at a place where elders, children, and workers crossed paths daily. It sought maximum impact with minimum ambiguity. Everyone would understand what was being challenged. For many families, the church was the first institution that treated them as citizens rather than problems. It taught names mattered, records mattered, and presence mattered. It preserved weddings, funerals, and milestones when other archives ignored them. To destroy it was to attack a ledger of lives lived honestly. That is why the city felt protective before it felt afraid. You do not negotiate when a symbol is targeted. You defend it by refusing to let the attack define the response. Harlem knew the stakes were larger than bricks and pews. This was about whether a community could be pushed into hiding. The planners believed the church represented weakness. They mistook patience for passivity and faith for fragility. They underestimated how symbols mobilize people who already know how to stand together. In trying to dominate a landmark, they revealed their own misunderstanding of power. By choosing the church, they chose a line. They chose to test whether terror could silence a place built to amplify voices. Harlem read that choice clearly, and the clarity hardened resolve. Whatever came next would not be loud. It would be decisive, shaped by an understanding that protecting symbols protects people. The building remained standing, calm and unaware, while the city prepared. The target was never random, and neither would be the answer. In the quiet hours before dawn, resolve spread without orders, binding neighbors through purpose, teaching them that defending a symbol meant defending themselves, and that response, measured and collective, would arrive intact, disciplined, and final without haste, without spectacle, and without leaving room for misinterpretation by anyone watching closely. The men behind the plan did not see themselves as daring. They saw themselves as insulated. Segregation had taught them that borders were real and permanent, lines that kept consequences on the other side. Harlem to them was distant in more than miles. It was a place they could threaten without being touched. That belief made them loud in private and sloppy in practice. They were not generals or strategists. They were a small cell stitched together by shared grievance and borrowed courage. Meetings happened in borrowed rooms, fueled by rumor and reinforcement rather than discipline. They traded stories that exaggerated their reach and minimized resistance. Each retelling made the city seem softer, less organized, easier to intimidate. The plan grew from that echo chamber, shaped by confidence that had never been tested. They mistook segregation for invisibility. Because they had crossed lines before without response, they assumed those lines protected them. Distance felt like armor. Hatred felt like belonging. In their minds, the city was fragmented, its power scattered among neighborhoods that did not coordinate. They believed institutions would argue, authorities would hesitate, and fear would do the rest. What they did not understand was structure. Harlem's strength did not announce itself, and that silence looked like weakness to outsiders. They did not see the relationships layered beneath daily life, the way information traveled through barbershops, kitchens, stoops, and pews. They did not recognize governance when it wore ordinary clothes. They saw a neighborhood, they missed a system. Their plan reflected that blindness. It relied on chance and spectacle, assuming panic would paralyze response. It counted on confusion and delay, on arguments about jurisdiction and proof. It assumed that if the act succeeded, the aftermath would fracture along predictable lines. This was not cunning. It was careless, built on assumptions rather than intelligence. Arrogance narrowed their vision. They ignored signals that contradicted their comfort. They dismissed warnings as exaggeration. They believed that being hateful made them bold, and being bold made them safe. The group mistook its own anger for power, and power, they believed, guaranteed impunity. History had taught them the wrong lessons. They had watched threats go unanswered elsewhere and concluded that all communities reacted the same way. They failed to account for a place where restraint was organized and patience was strategic. They underestimated how quickly resolve could replace fear when lines were crossed deliberately. Within the cell, doubts were smoothed over. Anyone who hesitated was reminded of loyalty and purpose. They framed the target as symbolic, then told themselves symbols were fragile. The more they talked, the more inevitable the plan felt. Momentum replaced judgment. The absence of immediate resistance was taken as confirmation. They believed hatred was protection. They believed distance was safety. They believed wrong. What they could not see was that their carelessness had already exposed them. Names, movements, and intentions leave traces, especially when shared among people who confuse secrecy with obscurity. By the time confidence peaked, the city had already adjusted. The men mistook quiet for ignorance and calm for delay. They did not realize that their assumptions had placed them inside a map they could not read. Harlem did not need to announce awareness to have it. The cell's undoing was not a dramatic confrontation. It was the slow collapse of the story they told themselves. Once their beliefs were stripped away, nothing remained to protect them. They had built a plan on distance, and distance vanished the moment understanding arrived. They thought Harlem was untouchable because they believed touch required proximity. They learned too late that proximity is not measured in miles. It is measured in attention, and attention had already found them, steady and unhurried, ready to move the moment patience decided. Bumpy Johnson did not react the way others expected because he was not hearing the rumor the way they were. Where some heard outrage and danger, he heard logistics, timing, movement, intention. He understood immediately that this threat did not belong in the open. Public noise would not weaken it. It would sharpen it. Calling the police would invite delay, paperwork, jurisdictional confusion, and leaks. Delay was oxygen. Exposure was acceleration. A threat like this fed on attention, on the satisfaction of being acknowledged. Bumpy knew that men who planned spectacle wanted reaction. Violence was no solution. Violence would confirm their worldview and scatter consequences in unpredictable directions. It would turn criminals into symbols and symbols into recruiting tools. Harlem would pay the price long after the smoke cleared. Bumpy was not interested in punishment. He was interested in prevention. He had spent years learning how fear behaved. Fear made people rush. Fear made them talk. Fear made mistakes contagious. He had also learned what fear did to men driven by ideology. It hardened them. It convinced them they were chosen. Fear created martyrs, and martyrs outlived bullets. Certainty did the opposite. Certainty collapsed ambition. It removed mystery and replaced it with inevitability. When men understood that their next step led only one place, they stopped moving. Certainty did not argue. It did not threaten. It concluded. Bumpy understood proportional response in a way few people did. The size of the threat did not determine the size of the response. The nature of the threat did. This was not a street insult or a territorial dispute. This was an attempt to erase a space that held people together. That required a response that removed capability without creating spectacle. He also understood time. Stopping the plan meant acting before it needed momentum. The longer it existed as an idea, the more it could spread. Cutting it off quietly would deny it that growth. Silence was not avoidance. It was strategy. Those around him waited for instructions that never came. That was deliberate. Orders created trails. Trails invited interruption. Bumpy worked through understanding rather than command. People who needed to know already did. People who did not were better left untouched. He recognized something else immediately. This could not look like retaliation. Retaliation invited escalation and invited outsiders to choose sides. The goal was to end the chapter, not start another one. Whatever happened needed to be final without being visible. Bumpy had navigated overlapping worlds his entire life. He knew how different systems reacted to pressure. Law enforcement needed proof. The press needed spectacle. Ideologues needed attention. None of those would solve this. Only certainty would. Certainty meant removing confidence, not bodies. It meant delivering information so precise that doubt could not survive it. It meant showing consequences without displaying them. The men planning the attack needed to understand that continuation was impossible, not dangerous. Impossible ended movements. Dangerous inspired them. He chose certainty because certainty respected the community he was protecting. It avoided panic. It avoided copycats. It avoided the temptation to turn a tragedy into theater. Harlem did not need another warning. It needed the threat gone. In that moment, Bumpy decided that the response would never be traced back to him, never be debated publicly, and never be repeated. That decision narrowed the options to one path. A quiet one. A decisive one. Whatever came next would not be loud. It would not be emotional. It would be precise enough to stop the plan and invisible enough to prevent another. That was the balance he chose. And once chosen, it did not waver. He had heard the threat clearly, and he knew exactly how to end it. Harlem depended on restraint more than ever. The package did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It appeared quietly, delivered without a return address, handled by someone who did not ask questions and did not linger. There was nothing threatening about its shape, nothing urgent about its weight. That was intentional. Panic would have been a mistake. Curiosity was the point. Inside was not violence. There were no weapons, no devices, no ticking pressure. What waited inside was far more final. Names, locations, times, connections, pieces of information arranged so cleanly that denial had nowhere to stand. It did not explain itself. It did not need to. The message lived in the accuracy. Whoever opened it understood immediately that secrecy was gone. The plan had been seen from the inside out. Movements that felt private were suddenly mapped. Conversations once believed safe were laid bare by implication. The package said everything by saying very little. You are known. You have been watched. You are not invisible. There were no threats attached because threats invite courage. This did not. It offered certainty, the kind that settles into the chest and makes decisions feel pointless, the kind that removes imagination from the future. There was no suggestion of what would happen next, only the understanding that nothing could continue. What made the package dangerous was restraint. It did not brag. It did not demand credit. It did not announce who sent it. That absence narrowed the options until there were none left. You cannot negotiate with certainty. You cannot intimidate it. You can only accept it. The men who received it understood something else as well. This was not law enforcement. It was too quiet, too precise, too uninterested in procedure. This was not a rival gang. There was no posturing, no territory being claimed. This was a boundary being enforced without debate. They also understood that reacting publicly would only confirm what they now feared. Any movement would be noticed. Any communication would be traced. The safest response was no response at all. Silence became survival. The plan dissolved without announcement. Materials were abandoned. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Calls stopped being returned. The idea itself collapsed under the weight of exposure. No one needed to say it out loud. Everyone involved understood that the chapter was over. Harlem never heard about the package. That was the point. There were no rumors to chase, no details to distort. The threat disappeared so completely that it felt unreal to those who had whispered about it days earlier. Fear did not linger because it was never allowed to bloom. The church doors opened as they always had. Choirs rehearsed. Children sat in pews. Life continued without interruption. That continuity was the true victory. Nothing had been destroyed. Nothing had been proven. Everything had been preserved. Somewhere else, far from Harlem, the package remained unclaimed. Not returned, not reported, not discussed. It existed only as memory and consequence. The men who had planned the attack carried that knowledge with them, heavy and private, understanding that the safest choice they would ever make was the one they had already made. No bomb ever exploded because it no longer needed to. The danger had been neutralized without spectacle, without blood, without a single public word. The most powerful message had already been delivered. By the time silence settled, someone had already won. And because that victory did not announce itself, it ensured that no one else would try again. The package did not end lives. It ended intent, and in doing so it erased the threat completely. Certainty replaced hatred, and prevention replaced revenge, leaving nothing to escalate and nothing to remember publicly, only a quiet understanding that crossing that line would never be attempted again by anyone. By morning, the threat was gone without ceremony. Phones that had carried quiet urgency the night before went unanswered. Meetings that were supposed to finalize details dissolved into cancellations without explanation. Routes were abandoned. Materials were left where they sat. The city did not wake to sirens or flashing lights. It woke to continuity, which was the point. Those who had been watching for signs found none. Names that had briefly drawn attention slipped back into ordinary anonymity. No one boasted. No one claimed credit. The plan did not unravel in public. It collapsed inward, pulled apart by the knowledge that secrecy no longer existed. When privacy dies, intent follows. There were no arrests announced because there was nothing to announce. Arrests require evidence gathered after action. This ended before action mattered. Law enforcement stayed distant, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing visible to pursue. The absence itself became the outcome. Within the circle that had once whispered about timing and placement, silence took hold. Silence not as defiance, but as retreat. Messages stopped. Connections went cold. People chose distance over coordination, forgetting names they had memorized days earlier. Survival became solitary again. The bombing never happened because the future had closed. The moment certainty replaced confidence, the idea lost momentum. Courage evaporated. Hate, stripped of secrecy, proved fragile. It could not stand exposure. It required shadows to feel powerful. Harlem felt the shift without being told. Fear did not linger because it had not been allowed to mature. There was no public warning to replay, no image to haunt memory. Life continued uninterrupted, which preserved dignity. The church remained a place of gathering, not a symbol of threat, narrowly avoided. What collapsed overnight was not a single plan, but a belief. The belief that distance protected intent, the belief that borders created safety, the belief that terror could be prepared quietly without consequence. Those ideas failed together, undone by the simple fact of being known. People who might have celebrated never did, because celebration would have explained too much. The power of the outcome depended on its quiet. To speak of it would have turned prevention into spectacle. Silence protected the lesson. Elsewhere, the men who had believed themselves insulated recalculated their lives. Not dramatically, practically. They avoided attention. They severed ties. They learned to stay small. The absence of punishment did not feel like mercy. It felt like containment. The city benefited from that containment without ever needing to acknowledge it. Streets did not fill with fear. Parents did not whisper warnings to children. The danger ended so completely that it became difficult to remember it had ever been real. That forgetting was earned. This is how dismantling looks when it is done correctly. No trophies, no aftermath, just a return to normal that feels almost suspicious in its smoothness. The plan did not fail because of resistance. It failed because it lost the conditions it required to exist. By nightfall, nothing had replaced it. No new threats emerged. No copycat ideas surfaced. The vacuum remained empty, which confirmed the finality. Something had been corrected, not postponed. What remained was understanding. Understanding that some dangers are best neutralized before they acquire language. Understanding that exposure can be more decisive than force. Understanding that silence, when chosen deliberately, can end things faster than any public confrontation. The plan collapsed overnight because it was never allowed to see daylight, and because it ended without witnesses, it left no myth behind to inspire repetition. That was the quiet success. The city slept, the church stood, and the future moved forward unchanged, as if the threat had been nothing more than a bad idea that died the moment it was truly seen, completely forgotten. Violence was expected because history had trained people to expect it. Threats like this usually ended in blood, arrests, headlines, and another chapter of grief folded into memory. What made this moment different was the refusal to follow that script. Bumpy Johnson understood that violence would have given the plot exactly what it wanted: attention, validation, and escalation. Blood creates martyrs. Martyrs create movements. He was not interested in feeding either. Instead, he chose certainty. Certainty strips ambition of oxygen. When men know they are seen, mapped, and understood, their courage thins quickly. Chaos thrives on confusion. Order thrives on clarity. By exposing the plan without dramatizing it, Bumpy removed its momentum. There was no enemy to fight, no stage to perform on, no victory to imagine. The threat dissolved because it could not adapt. Harlem felt the effect immediately. Fear did not ripple outward because there was nothing visible to fear. Streets stayed busy, doors stayed open. The church remained a place of routine rather than resistance. Life continuing normally was not accidental. It was the proof that the approach worked. Stability denies extremists their most useful tool: disruption. The Mafia understood this instinctively. They stayed distant, not out of fear, but respect for boundaries. Intervening would have complicated the balance, turning prevention into conflict. They recognized that this was not their terrain or their lesson to deliver. Power systems survive longest when they know when not to overlap. Silence, in this case, preserved order. Law enforcement remained quiet for similar reasons. There was no crime to interrupt, no public act to respond to, no panic to manage. The absence of spectacle kept authority diffuse and calm. Sometimes the most effective policing is rendered unnecessary by outcomes that leave nothing to pursue. What unfolded was control without blood. No one was punished publicly. No one was elevated as an example. The message traveled anyway, carried by understanding rather than fear. Those who needed to hear it did. Those who did not were never disturbed. This selectivity mattered. It prevented backlash and avoided inspiring imitation. Extremist ambition depends on reaction. Without reaction, it collapses into isolation. By refusing to meet hate with force, Bumpy denied it a mirror. He did not argue with it. He did not threaten it. He simply made its continuation impossible. That discipline required confidence deeper than anger. Harlem remained intact because the response matched the threat precisely. No more, no less. Violence would have spilled outward, touching people who had nothing to do with the plan. Silence contained it. Exposure ended it. The city absorbed the lesson without trauma. This moment redefined strength for those watching closely. Strength was not volume or speed. It was restraint aligned with purpose. It was knowing when action meant doing less, not more. Many men could have pulled triggers. Few could have resisted that impulse when fear was justified. The success of this approach lay in its invisibility. Nothing dramatic marked the victory. That invisibility prevented the story from becoming recruitment material. It prevented names from becoming symbols. It prevented hate from gaining a narrative foothold. In the end, no one needed to die for the threat to end. That fact alone distinguished this moment from countless others. Violence was never needed because control had already been established long before. Understanding replaced fear. Structure replaced chaos. Harlem stayed whole, not because it fought, but because it refused to be pulled into someone else's design. That refusal was the most decisive act of all. Years later, this choice would be remembered quietly as proof that protection can arrive without sirens, that courage can look like patience, and that communities endure longest when they choose precision over spectacle under pressure without surrender, becoming what they oppose. Years later, the threat felt distant, but the lesson felt close. Churches still opened their doors each Sunday, not as monuments to survival, but as ordinary places where life continued. Children ran the same steps. Choirs practiced the same hymns. Nothing stood as a reminder because nothing needed to. The absence of damage became the memory. People spoke about that time without details. They didn't name men or dates. They talked about how a danger had been real and how it had ended without spectacle. In Harlem, stories survive when they teach behavior, not when they rehearse fear. This one taught restraint. The group that once imagined violence faded into obscurity, not defeated publicly, not chased through courts, just dissolved by exposure and certainty. Their plan never matured into identity. Without attention, there was nothing to recruit around. Hate requires an audience. Harlem denied it one. What endured instead was understanding. Boundaries settled into routine. Churches were understood as untouchable, not because of protection promised later, but because protection had already been proven. The city moved with a quiet confidence that did not need reinforcement. Bumpy Johnson's name remained, but its meaning shifted. To some, he had been power. To others, danger. Over time, he became something else entirely. He became a reference for restraint, the man who understood that preventing terror mattered more than punishing it. That distinction separated guardians from gangsters. Older residents remembered how calm had replaced panic, how life had gone on without interruption. They remembered that the most effective responses often looked like nothing at all. Younger generations absorbed the lesson without hearing the story. They felt it in behavior, in the way certain lines were never tested. The Mafia never claimed credit, and that silence mattered. Claiming credit would have invited competition. Silence preserved the boundary. Power recognized power and stepped back. The city stayed whole because no one tried to own the outcome. Law enforcement records showed nothing unusual. That absence told its own story. The lack of paperwork was proof that prevention had succeeded. When terror is stopped before it manifests, there is nothing to investigate. That quiet success is rarely celebrated, but deeply felt. Harlem remembered not because it was told to, but because the result shaped daily life. Fear did not linger. Vigilance did not harden into suspicion. People trusted the stability they experienced. Trust grew roots. Years passed. Buildings changed. Faces changed. The lesson remained portable. It traveled through tone and expectation, through the shared understanding that some threats end best when they are denied oxygen. The city learned that certainty, applied precisely, could end chapters without explosions. Bumpy's legacy settled into that understanding, not as a warning, but as guidance. Real power did not chase enemies. It protected spaces. It did not seek applause. It preserved continuity. That was the measure that lasted. Some victories leave rubble and headlines. This one left normal days, normal nights, bells ringing, doors opening, children safe. Harlem carried on, and in carrying on, it proved the point. The day Harlem was never targeted again did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, and it stayed. It remained a civic instinct, passed like etiquette, shaping decisions before they became debates. Store owners measured tone. Organizers measured risk. Elders measured history. The memory worked invisibly, correcting course early. That invisibility was its strength. Nothing tempted fate because fate had already been educated. In that education, Harlem found peace without surrender. The story endured as instruction, not warning, teaching that communities protect themselves best by choosing precision, patience, and proportion. When danger returns elsewhere, Harlem's answer remains ready, calm, and unmistakable, proving again that restraint, applied early, can save lives, places, and futures without noise, spectacle, or needless harm ever.